Hello, my name is Professor Stuart Tyson Smith of the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I'm going to talk to you about unwrapping the mummy, looking at Hollywood fantasies and Egyptian realities. Mummies have been a fascination of the West for a long period of time, and the most recent enthusiasm and obsession with mummies began with Napoleon Bonaparte, his conquest of Egypt, and the savants or scholars that he brought along with him in 1798 to document what he had found in Egypt and both the ancient history of Egypt, monuments and so on, to collect antiquities to bring back to the new museum at the Louvre, the former palace of the deposed King of France, and to better understand also modern Egypt and the natural history of Egypt. It was an exercise in kind of colonial cataloging. He wanted to know his new empire and be able to document what was in it. It was also an attempt to connect his empire with ancient empires like ancient Egypt. And they produced an amazing set of volumes called the Description de l'Egypte, beautifully illustrated, giant in size, kind of elephant folio, these big, huge things. If you ever get a chance to see one, they're just amazing. I actually have a copy at UCLA that I took a look at, some of the volumes, just incredible. But Napoleon himself encountered a mummy, here you can see it here, and his charge to his troops before the Battle of the Pyramids, where he defeated the Ottoman Turkish forces. He said, "Think of it, soldiers, from the summit of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you." So he's very much conscious of the past and its significance for the present. The publication and accounts that flowed forth from this expedition, as well as the objects that went on display in the Louvre, and since the British defeated him, that went to the British, like the Rosetta Stone, the most famous one, and that ended up in the new, again, brand new British Museum, helped spur a huge wave of Egyptomania, but also a fascination with mummies. And here you can see a mummy unwrapping party. So mummies became a kind of something to acquire as a tourist. So it was a souvenir to bring back. And in fact, in the 1830s, an advisor to Muhammad Ali, the Khedive of Egypt, technically under the Ottoman Empire, but really forging an independent Egypt, it told Muhammad Ali that, in fact, anyone from the West coming to Egypt had not properly done Egypt without coming back with a mummy in one hand and a crocodile in the other hand. Mummy unwrapping parties became all the rage with events like this one, where you could purchase a ticket for it. Wealthy people would have mummy unwrapping parties, and it fit the sort of macabre sensibilities of Victorian England, where, again, it's this idea, a little bit of transgression that was in a sort of titillating way. They knew that it wasn't proper to take the dead and unwrap them and expose them in this undignified way, but to look upon the face of someone who had died thousands of years ago gave this kind of, impact and titillation and entertainment, which is kind of sad when you think about it, but was quite popular at the time. We also see mummies and ancient Egypt generally entering into all aspects of society, buildings, the decorative arts, and of course for selling things like perfume. And the connection with mummy here is this little perfume bottle canopic jar, and which is weird because the canopic jar held the internal organs mummified separately of the deceased. And so eau de guts, I don't know, it doesn't sound very appealing to me. But apparently it sold perfume, and in fact the inscription is the correct one. The canopic jars invoke the protection of the 4 sons of Horus. This one is dedicated to Hapi, who protects the lungs of the deceased. So I really wonder if whoever made this perfume bottle wasn't making a kind of Easter egg style pun, referring back to the god who protected the lungs that would inhale and smell the perfume. Could just be random, but I suspect there was something to that. So it's no surprise that when the infant film industry appeared, one of the first films was a mummy movie. One of the first films to be shown in public was entitled Cleopatra, another obsession of the film industry, Cleopatra-themed films. And it was about her revived mummy and the nefarious things that were got up to by an evil kind of magician. And I've never seen it. I don't know if it survived. It would be fun to see. And of course, all you would need is it was made in France, but all you would need, since it's a silent film, is to have the dialogue cards transcribed into whatever language. But it also played off of a number of themes that we see running throughout all Egypt-themed movies, but especially the Mummy films. And that's the idea of sensuality. Here you see Bera in a classic performance of Cleopatra in a rather odd pose, but it emphasized her sensuality, skimpy outfits. It was in the days before the code, when people had to cover up a little bit more. And so it played off of that idea of sensuality, but also danger. So her stage name, Theda Bera, is actually an anagram for Arab death. And this fits into Edward Said's idea of Orientalism. So the idea of the West constructing an East, particularly a Middle East, as a place of sensuality, think belly dancing and things like this, but also, and harems, but also of danger, of violence and so on. Think, Cleopatra herself experimenting with poisons on prisoners to better defeat her opponents. So this combination of sensuality, violence, exoticness is something that we see running throughout all of these films. You see that in later films like this Cleopatra, although I have to say I like this version of the film starring Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor, in part because Elizabeth Taylor plays Cleopatra as a strong female lead. Yes, they play up the sensuality, but they also play up her astuteness and ability to navigate political situations, as opposed to the recent series Rome, which played her as a sort of drug-addled sexpot. Really, really bad. But I would love to see a film where it emphasized her intelligence and her acumen and her political savviness more than her sensuality. Probably won't happen, but it would be fun. You see that sensuality and colorfulness and exotic theme in epic adventure films like Exodus, the famous Cecil B. DeMille version, of course the more recent version by Ridley Scott, which had its own problems. And then, of course, the Indiana Jones films. The first one, Raiders of the Lost Ark, he actually goes to Egypt and is clearly excavated in Egypt. And so it involves that. But again, it's sort of action-adventure. And then finally, the mummy genre, which is by far and away the most common. There have been over 100 mummy films made, starting in the silent era, at least a couple of dozen before talkies came up. The mummy genre, the more recent films, combine all three of these things, sort of the sensual quality of things, the action-adventure epics, and large scale and everything else, and then the idea of the revived mummy wreaking vengeance as a result of a cursed scroll. Now, before I go into more detail on real mummies, I'd give you a little bit more of my background. So in addition to being an archaeologist and an Egyptologist, I also have 3 major film credits, starting with Stargate, a movie I got brought into just after I'd filed my PhD, a nice infusion of cash, and I played a real pivotal role in the film. We won't be talking much about it. The main thing I did was translate the dialogue into ancient Egyptian. But I also extensively commented on the script and wrote a lot of the dialogue. Actually, the actor James Spader, playing the Egyptologist, read. But I think one of the best things about this, in addition to the infusion of cash at a point in time when I really needed it, was also that everybody on the set called me Dr. Smith, which for someone who just got their PhD was pretty validating. I have to say that was pretty cool. And actually in 2018, I revisited that with a streaming production, so low budget, but I think it turned out really great, where they wanted to recreate the feel of the original film, where the language played a central role in the plot. And so they brought me in and I did the same thing there. One of the actors in the original film Stargate was actually in The Mummy, and he saw there was Egyptian dialogue, and he told the director, Steve Summers, you got to bring in this guy, Stuart Smith. He'll do great for you. He's not, a nitpicky academic, and he'll do a great job translating the dialogue, coaching the actors. And so I got that gig, and then, of course, when the sequel came out, The Mummy Returns, I also got that gig as well, with the main task of translating the dialogue into ancient Egyptian, But then also gave them advice on the scripts. In Stargate, they pretty much took all of my advice, which is pretty cool to see. In the Mummy movies, they took about half of my advice and ignored the rest. And fair enough, at least I got some input. And the language in all of these films turned out beautiful, including The Rock, who I coached on a fuzzy cell phone call to somewhere outside of Marrakesh, because they were too cheap to fly me out there. Would have loved to go out there and see the desert there and just visit Marrakesh. Still on my bucket list. But in any case, The Rock did a great job too. So really wonderful. So now I thought I'd give you, before I move on, I thought I'd give you a little feel for how ancient Egyptian was spoken. And you may think, it's just picture writing, so how do we know? But in fact, we have a pretty good idea of how it was pronounced around the time of King Tutankhamun, so around 1400 to 1200 BC. And here you see a scene from Stargate. I'll just give you an example of pronunciation. The Egyptologist character, played by James Spader, who I work with a lot, great guy, did a beautiful job, is encountering this civilization on another planet of descendants of ancient Egyptians. He thinks he can understand the language, but he's trying to establish some rapport, so he gives the local leader a candy bar. And he takes a bite and he says, "Oh, Bani, Bani way." So everyone now, repeat after me, "Bani, Bani way." And so you just said, "How sweet," or literally twice sweet, which is how the Egyptians expressed that idea. And so at that point in the film, Egyptologists, who of course went to see it out of curiosity, immediately realized, the dialogue's in ancient Egyptian. And about half of the film's dialogue is in ancient Egyptian. And more than that, I actually attempted to reconstruct original pronunciation. And you may ask, well, how do you do that? Well, here you see Egyptian hieroglyphs, and of course they look like little picture writing, but in fact they're all phonetic. So you can come up with a phonetic transcription of Ramses Meriamun, which translated would mean Re gave birth to him. Names usually have a meaning, and beloved of Amun is a kind of epithet to show that he was favored of the god. But what we have spelled out is a string of consonants, not vowels. And also the consonants change over time. So we can go to Coptic, which is used in the Coptic Christian church as a liturgical language. So it's used in the church services. It's not spoken today, except for a few people who want to try and revive it. And here you can see a text a couple hundred years old with Coptic on the left and Arabic on the right to help as a guide. And Coptic, the script that you see there, is actually a version of ancient Greek, so it includes vowels. But there's a long separation between 1200 BC and Ramses II and 1700 when this particular text was written. So we can go to contemporary texts written in cuneiform, and that's a syllabary, which has consonant-vowel combinations. And what do you know? Ramses Meriamun appears in the cuneiform texts. And here you can see how it's transcribed into that syllabary. And with a little bit of a correction, we can get to an original transcription of Riyama Shesha Mai Yamana. And so immediately we can recognize there are some consonants missing, and you can see that already as well in Coptic. Final consonants tend often to drop, and that's what we see here. But we still don't have vowels, but we can insert the vowels here and come up with an original pronunciation of Riyama Sesa Mai Yamane. So very different from the way Egyptologists would pronounce it, which works beautifully for the main conceit of the film Stargate, which was that the Egyptologist character didn't immediately recognize what the language was, even though it was ancient Egyptian. But once he figured out that the vowels were missing and figured out what they were, he could then come up to speed with the language, but with a little bit of the tutorial from his love interest in the film. And for the Mummy movies, it works beautifully because this is exactly the time period when these Akkadian texts were written and when we have the best evidence for ancient pronunciation that the movies were set. So Seti I, who's assassinated in the film, is in fact the father of Ramses II. So Ramses actually is probably somewhere in the movie, but not specifically listed. He would be in one of the scenes in the background of a prince wearing a sidelock of youth, probably. As I recall, I remember seeing someone in the background of one of the scenes. So it works beautifully for both films. Now, in terms of real mummies, I have a background as an archaeologist. I worked in Luxor, ancient Thebes, in the Theban necropolis, and you can see all sorts of mummy bits, a disembodied head, and the torso that it probably goes to. Other mummy bits, lots of bone and so on. Not a good place if you're squeamish. But it's the result of episodes of looting over and over again, so everything gets a bit churned. But we found quite a few examples of mummies, so I've had my own first encounters with mummies. And then today I direct a project at the site of Tombos in northern Sudan, which was an ancient Egyptian colony that was established during the New Kingdom, but continued to the period of the Nubian dynasty when Kushite Nubian kings from Sudan ruled Egypt. It's a very picturesque spot. It's located at the headwaters of the Third Cataract, and it was an important colonial center, kind of watching over the former capital of Kush, which lies just about 10 kilometers or so to the south of us. And I'd just like to do a few quick acknowledgments. I'll be using examples from Tombos as we go along of the different organizations that have funded our research, and also the colleagues that have helped with that research, especially my co-director, Michelle Bouzon, who's a bioarchaeologist, so she looks at the human remains, the mummies. Hassan Ahmed, who represents the Sudanese Antiquities Service in the National Museum in Khartoum, and who's been a wonderful colleague throughout. And then Professor Ali Osman from the University of Khartoum, who you see in the middle here. Hassan Ahmed is in blue, and Michelle is the only woman there, and second from the right, wearing white. These just a wonderful collegial environment. I've been encouraged by Ali Osman to work in this area, even though he could have claimed the site for the university and himself. Just an excellent experience, just a wonderful country and people to work with. And the same thing with the people of Tombos, who also I would like to thank. We live for a couple of months every year, more or less every year we're excavating, and they just welcome us into the village. Here we got invited to the men's henna party for a wedding. We've been to several of these weddings, just wonderful events, again, beautiful people. They also contribute directly to our project as we hire a bunch of folks to help us out with the excavation. Okay, so let's move on to real mummies, as in Hollywood mummies. So the Mummy movie that really started it all off was the 1932 film starring Boris Karloff, directed by Karl Freund, a famous director, and it's considered to be a classic in the movie industry because of the direction. It's very different, though, from the more recent ones. It's a much slower plot. It's more suspense and spookiness than it is sort of the action-adventure of the more recent films. And interestingly enough, Boris Karloff plays very little time as the mummy, and most of the time as a kind of sinister Egyptian magician figure, looking a bit pruny and mummified, but otherwise a human interacting, trying to find his long-lost love. And part of the plot was based on a story by Arthur Conan Doyle called The Ring of Thoth, about someone who was searching for their long-lost love, and was set in a museum in a similar way that the kind of culminating scenes of the 1932 Mummy film are set in the museum, where he's trying to reunite with his long-lost love. Other elements of the plot are different, but they're clearly drawing off of it, of course uncredited. The story itself involves the idea of a person who has transgressed, who's committed a major sacrilege, and then is mummified alive and buried alive in the tomb. And you'd think, well, this is absolutely fanciful and completely inaccurate, but in fact, it's based on some real events. And there's a number of nice touches in this film. Balderston had covered the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun, had talked a lot with Egyptologists. I think he had read a lot too, because he's clearly pulling from well-established ideas at that time, some of which have changed, but certainly in 1932 the film has a number of details that reflect some knowledge of the period. One of my favorite things is that they're looking at the mummy here. The spiritualist is saying, don't mess with it, there's a curse. And they found a box that's sealed that says, don't open this because there's a curse. And the young guy, of course, being a young guy, says, and it's because it's a really nice, beautiful thing. It says, oh, we got to see what's inside this box. Let's do that first. And the Egyptologist character on the right-hand side asserts that more has been learned from studying bits of broken pottery than from all the sensational finds, and our job is to increase the sum of human knowledge of the past, not to satisfy our own curiosity. And that's every archaeologist, especially dirt archaeologists like myself, immediately went, yes! So even though, it seems like archaeology, Indiana Jones, is, trying to, searching for the spectacular find, archaeologists, in fact, are more interested in uncovering the past. In any case, the plot of the film is based on an actual ancient Egyptian conspiracy, the assassination of Ramses III, pharaoh, who ruled at around 1100 BC. And we have the trial documents from this, as well as the mummies of Ramses III and his son, Pentaweri, who was just labeled as Unknown Man E because he was in a coffin where his name had been excised, which would be, or actually it didn't even appear on the coffin, which would be a major bad thing. He also was not deliberately mummified, but just naturally his body was preserved. He had a bit of natron thrown over him, which may have helped dry the body out, and a sheepskin tossed on top, which would have been a kind of unclean thing. So clearly a mummy that was not a happy mummy. He also looks very unhappy. And that led to early theories that he was buried alive. And that's because in the trial documents, they implicate this prince, Pentaweri, and his mother, the queen, to assassinate the king to place him on the throne a little ahead of schedule. And they mentioned that he was left to die by his own. And so one interpretation of that was that he was buried alive in the tomb and ended up suffocating or dying of other, prostration. But in fact, more recent evidence suggests that he was allowed or forced to drink poison and therefore died without being, executed by impalement or something like that, which is one of the punishments that was meted out to some of the conspirators. Ramses III, interestingly enough, a recent CAT scan of his mummy has shown that, in fact, his throat was slit from ear to ear. So the assassination attempt was not an attempt, it was successful. And Pentaweri and the other conspirators were punished. So clearly, that main plot, the idea of transgression, it's a little bit different. It's not assassinating a king, although a king is assassinated in the more recent Mummy film. But it's really it's securing this forbidden scroll and deploying its magic to revive his long-lost love. In fact, the misuse of pharaonic royal magic also played a role in the harem conspiracy. Several priests were convicted of stealing a scroll from the temple that was meant only for the king and using magical spells from that scroll to paralyze Ramses III's bodyguard and penetrate into the chambers, his personal chambers, and assassinate him, which is really a fascinating insight into belief and punishment and crime. Probably it was effective, because if people believe in these kind of things, then they might really have been paralyzed by them. We can never know, but it's a fascinating detail. In any case, clearly Balderston is drawing on this. There is actually one ancient Egyptian mummy story, that of Setnakhamwas and the Mummies. And this is the only story where an ancient Egyptian actually encounters a mummy that's been kind of brought to life. It starts with Setnakhamwas playing a game of Senet, a kind of board game, with a mummy in exchange, and the stakes are a scroll of forbidden magic. So sound familiar again from the harem conspiracy and then also the film. He succeeds, he gets the scroll, but realizes it's cursed, and he runs back to the mummy and says, "You gotta take this thing back so it will lift the curse." And the mummy says, "No, you've got to find my long-lost love," again, sound familiar, and bring her mummy back so that we can be reunited, and the mummy of their child. And so Setnakhamwas, Setna is just a priestly title, decides to go off and find the mummy. And so here we see a number of things drawn that we see in the film. The forbidden scroll, in this case it revives the mummy, but in fact in the other case it just gave him kind of divine power, but it was an act of sacrilege in both cases. And then when it comes to finding the long lost love, in both films, in both the film rather and the story, we see the mummy appearing to point the way. In the story, for Set Nachamwas to find the tomb whose location has been forgotten, the mummy actually appears to him and points it out to him. And then in the film, Boris Karloff, playing the revived mummy, points out to the archaeologist where the tomb of his long-lost love is, so he can then go and revive her. So clearly Balderston recognized all of these things and realized, and sort of deployed them rather, in the film itself, in writing the script. So as a result, it is a remarkably accurate film, or at least it draws upon ancient Egyptian ideas and sensibilities. However, I do want to emphasize that the Egyptians normally didn't think of mummies as being revived and the walking dead and achieving immortality in that way. Mummies were made, in fact, to make the deceased immortal in the afterlife, not in this life. But you can see how people got the idea that that was not the case. Now, this was an extremely popular film. It did extremely well in the box office. You had a lot of spin-off like this, so these kind of tie-ins, commercial tie-ins, are nothing new as well. Here he's trying to sell houses and things and investments and so on, but it shows hieroglyphs. He's speaking hieroglyphs. And interestingly enough, any Egyptologist will immediately recognize that Boris Karloff is actually speaking ancient Egyptian in the film when he's reciting these magical spells and so on. But I could never figure out what exactly he was saying. It never made sense in the context of the film. So when I got a copy of the script, I actually looked at those lines, and in fact what he's doing is just pronouncing names and random phrases. So for example, at one point he says, Sa Ankare, as a magical spell to attack his enemies. And in fact, that's just the name of a king. But at least, again, Balderston, I don't think he knew hieroglyphs, but he knew about hieroglyphs and the ancient Egyptian language, and they went to the effort of wanting to make it sound reasonably authentic. So with the Mummy films, there was kind of a long hiatus until the 1940s, when a whole series of films came out, and they were kind of low-budget, B-grade movies, and out to entertain and titillate during the Second World War when people needed a distraction. And they were all about a mummy who was revived to wreak vengeance on the deceased by a group of people who were kind of practicing the ancient Egyptian religion. And this is drawn from another story by Arthur Conan Doyle called Lot 249, where an Oxford Don gets a hold of a papyrus and a mummy, reads the papyrus, reactivates the mummy, and directs the mummy to kill his Egyptological academic rivals, which is brings academic rivalry up to a scale that I've never experienced, thankfully, but is a really interesting premise and plot. These things got pretty outlandish. One of them, for example, somehow the mummy is transported to Louisiana and the Louisiana Bayou, and one of his first victims is a guy named Cajun Joe. So a bit absurd, but if you like bad movies, I mean, they're so bad that they're actually pretty funny. But otherwise, I don't particularly recommend them. And there were a few other mummy movies here and there, including Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, which is pretty hilarious. Not their best comic turn, but solid. Until 1999, when we see the revival of the Mummy franchise, where they really create a mashup of the 1932 Boris Karloff mummy with a basic plot of searching for your long-lost love to revive her and rejoin her and make her immortal again and to accompany you throughout in a kind of immortal life. And then this idea of the mummies being revived and wreaking vengeance on archaeologists. And as I mentioned, I was advisor on the film. They took some of my advice, didn't consult me for some things like the background you see here with the giant pyramid in the background, which is something you wouldn't see at Thebes, which is where it's supposed to be. It's more consistent with Giza. But they got a lot right, too, in some of the background scenes. And the costume, he's wearing black. Egyptians would never have worn black. Usually they wore white, but sometimes more colorful things. But not black. However, his head is shaved, which is consistent with the priesthood. He's supposed to be the high priest of Osiris. So again, it's kind of a mixed bag in accuracy. But they did take a number of my notes. So for example, the language, which turned out beautifully. So they brought me in to do all the translations, and I, again, reconstructed it to sound like what might have sounded like around that time, the reign of Seti I. And then jewelry. The jewelry is really pretty good. You can see what the king is wearing is not bad. That beautiful pendant that he's wearing, and the similar one that the leading character Imhotep is wearing. And also, I told them only bronze weapons, no steel or iron at that period of time. And they took my advice. So all the weaponry is bronze. It's pretty good. However, on the downside, the black outfit and the idea of the painted outfit, and there were plenty of skimpy outfits in ancient Egypt, but they didn't paint them on like this. And they did take some of the notes that I gave them. So I told them the desert group, who they were going to call, were protecting the secret site and trying to keep the mummy from being revived, should be called Medjay. Medjay were a Nubian pastoral nomadic group that often served in the Egyptian military, and in fact, their last incarnation was as a security force who guarded the Valley of the Kings during the New Kingdom. And so absolutely appropriate that some survival of that hidden out in the desert. I mean, it fits very nicely with the theme of the film. So I was very pleased to see that was in there. And by the way, the guy on the right-hand side is Eric Avari, the one who let them know that, or suggested my name to the producers, Steve Summers, the director of the Mummy movies, and got me the gig. So a tip of the hat to him. So there are a number of things that are reasonably accurate. Again, the Mummy story plotline is based on that Balderson script, which does tie back a little bit into the conspiracy against Ramses III. The scarab you see in the background is absolutely accurate. It represents the god Khepri, who pushes the sun across the horizon at the moment of his rebirth at the dawning. But the flesh-eating scarabs, no, completely inaccurate. I did actually give them an option to say something that would be equivalent, but they just ignored me. Also, the Book of the Dead, absolutely a real document, meant to revive the deceased, but spiritually. But also a series of aids to help them become an immortal soul in the afterlife. And not a hinged book like you see there, but rather a scroll of papyrus. Similar with canopic jars, so they have a series of canopic jars. The first four are just great, including jackal, baboon, and human head, and a what's the other head? I think a dog headed as well. And so absolutely accurate. That's how these different figures appear. But then a fifth one, lion-headed for the heart, I guess, but not accurate. No, I told them no. 4 canopic jars, not 5. Did they listen to me? No, they did not. But the chant he's doing is drawn from the Book of the Dead, and is actually in ancient Egyptian, which is pretty cool. Real canopic jars look like this, and there you can see, falcon. So it's human, falcon, baboon, jackal-headed for the 4 sons of Horus. I already mentioned Happy before. And we actually found a canopic jar, a full set of 4 of them. This one is dedicated to the god Hapi, and dedicated to the lector priest, priest who recited the rituals, named Hapi after the Nile god of inundation instead, but a lot of happiness going around with his canopic jars. Sorry, just couldn't resist that. Okay, then, of course, the Mummy spawn, the Mummy Returns, where a secret mummy cult is stationed in the basement of the British Museum. I believe they've, forgiven me for that transgression. So actually, these mummy films are really popular as kind of cult classics amongst Egyptologists, in part because of the sort of Egyptomania aspect of it, but then also the fact that the dialogue is really in ancient Egyptian, and not just Egyptologically spoken, dull sort of ancient Egyptian, but vocalized ancient Egyptian, so a real attempt to reconstruct what it sounded like. This, in turn, draws on a real mashup with the 1959 Hammer classic production of The Mummy, with Christopher Reeve starring as the Mummy and Peter Cushing as the Egyptologist. I forget the name of the guy who played the Egyptian character, but in this case, we again have a revived mummy cult that wants to bring the mummy back to wreak vengeance on archaeologists, again playing heavily off of Arthur Conan Doyle's Lot 249 as well. It's all connected. The 1959 Mummy has one of my favorite lines, and the character playing the sort of secretly priest, continuing the ancient religion of ancient Egypt, and who revives the mummy to wreak vengeance on the archaeologists for disturbing the tombs of the dead and putting them on display, which he takes the archaeologist played by Peter Cushing to task for. And this is something that's entering into a modern dialogue of mummies, and should they be displayed? How should you display them in a way that's respectful? And he says to the Peter Cushing, the archaeologist character, he says, "He who robs the graves of Egypt dies." And so, look at me, dead man walking. Sometime the curse will catch up to me. But this also reflects something, a theme called Victorian Gothic. We can see it in stories like She by H. Rider Haggard. The idea of transgressing, of robbing the dead, of displaying them, and then of vengeance, of blowback, coming back to haunt you with curses and revived mummies and so on. And it's a theme we see at a number of levels, a kind of guilt for the British Empire and other imperial powers. We see that at play with Tom Cruise's The Mummy, and more the story that it's based on, which is a Bram Stoker novel called Jewel of the Seven Stars, that was made into a number of different films in the past, but adapted for Tom Cruise. Not a very good film with Tom Cruise. I think it was a lost opportunity to create a new mummy protagonist, a female, a kind of feminist parable. But the plot draws on Hatshepsut as the evil queen who was erased from history, but just makes an evil character of the mummy. And don't ask me what's going on with the four eyes. There is some spoken ancient Egyptian. It's done in a more Egyptological pronunciation, but they went to some lengths, but basically, I think, a lost opportunity, but an important aspect of the genre. So how does all this compare to real mummies? So real mummies, as you can see here, with a very lifelike appearance, not always the case. This was especially popular starting around 1000 BC, which is when this mummy dates from, maybe a little bit later than that. You have inlaid eyes and even makeup and padding to make the deceased look as lifelike as possible. It's really spooky seeing them. But in fact, they did this not per se to preserve the body, but to make the body suitable for the soul to reside in. And the spells that you find in the Book of the Dead, like the opening of the mouth ceremony, were meant to make of the mummy, as you would a statue, a suitable receptacle for the soul to appear, to receive offerings, to communicate with the living. It's important to recognize that mummification was not just about the immortality of the deceased, although that was an important aspect of it, but it was also about the communion of the living ancestors, living with their ancestors, so with the living with the dead, in the form of their Ba and the Ka. The Ba could move around. If you encountered a ghost in ancient Egypt, and we do have ghost stories, it would be the Ba. The Ka was more rooted in the tomb, received offerings. And so people would invoke the assistance of their deceased relative in this way. Ancient Egyptian tombs were often in the form of this. Here you see at Tombos. You can see a couple of tombs with shafts and mud brick superstructures around it. In fact, we have a whole series of little pyramids during this period of time, starting around 1450 BC. We see pyramids stop being used by kings and royalty and start being used by the elite, but smaller, made of mud brick. So we just find the foundations of them. We reconstructed this one here, an important colonial official and his mother, gotta love a boy who takes care of his mom. And you can see here the rituals that I mentioned before. The mummy would have been stood upright before the tomb, before being entombed and placed underground in the burial chambers. These above-ground chapels were accessible in a place where the dead and living could commune. The underground chambers were usually sealed, although sometimes we see people leaving letters to the dead, for example, to commune and communicate with and make appeals to their ancestors. Now, normally we don't have very good preservation of things like coffins and mummies, but we do have a lot of evidence for mummification. I got very excited when I saw this coffin because of the state of preservation And I don't know how well you can see it, but if you look carefully on the side, you can see a figure of a god and some hieroglyphs. So as one does, I started reading off the hieroglyphs, Imachi Cher Duamutef, blessed before Duamutef, one of the four sons of Horus. But fortunately, Michelle rushed up to me and said, Stuart, no, because you know what happens when you start reading hieroglyphic inscriptions in front of mummies. You know, they start getting up and revived, and they chase after you. And trust me, you know, having the living dead chase after you is not a fun thing. Just, you know, puts a cramp on everyone's style. So fortunately, we averted disaster. But we have found some larger pieces of coffins that are a little more recognizable. So here we see a high-level priest and his wife, Horemheb and Becky, and beautifully carved coffins. So we have some pretty wealthy individuals buried at Tombos, and they had all sorts of whistles and bells. Again, not geared towards reviving them in life, but allowing to make the spiritual transition to immortality and death, and to continue to interact with the world of the living. We find this in different kinds of amulets, like heart scarabs, which were meant to prevent the heart from testifying against the deceased or letting something slip that the deceased did that was wrong when they were judged in the afterlife. And we see a page from the Book of the Dead where this is happening. So you can see the deceased on the left in front of Osiris, and then Anubis, the guide of the dead, presiding over the balance of the heart on one side, Ma'at, or truth, right, justice on the other side, and it had better balance out, or you will have an eternity of damnation. But if you're, you know, seen to be a good person, then you'll go to the ancient Egyptian equivalent of heaven. Because we have poor organic preservation, we haven't found a full copy of papyrus roll, but we did find one of the weirdest things I've ever found, which is hieroglyphs on a skull. This is a skull here. I think you can see there's some writing on it. And here to help you out is a visible induced luminescence version of it, which really brings out the hieroglyphs themselves. And really freaky. I think what happened was that the bodies, and this is what we found in the tomb, the mummies have been completely torn apart. And I think a copy of the Book of the Dead crumpled, rested up on the skull, and the writing transferred onto the skull, leaving it there for us to find 3,000 years later. And I actually showed this to an expert on the Book of the Dead, and they were actually able to identify the spell from it and confirm that indeed it was a copy of the Book of the Dead. So our folks had this. Other things that the elite had to have were ushabtis. You can see here that were meant either to help substitute for the deceased in the afterlife. This is what the afterlife looked like to ancient Egyptians. This is the famous tomb of Senedjem at Luxor, beautiful, gorgeous tomb. But you were expected to perform all this agricultural labor for the gods. The good news is you got to commune with the gods. So if you had an ushabti, the ushabti could jump up and do the work for you. Or one idea is that they may also have been able to simply assist and kind of expand on the amount of work that you could do for the gods to gain their favor. And so these kind of things we see for the elite, but for more modest people, we would see sort of more modest coffins, including clay coffins, which is kind of interesting, and then simpler wooden coffins. The one I showed you earlier was kind of a coffin masterpiece. This one was a relatively simple one made out of wood, still with a prosperous person, but not necessarily the wealthiest person at the site, and was found in one of the more modest tombs. Similarly, with deceased individuals, we rarely find canopic jars that would indicate evisceration, which is usually thought of as a standard part of mummification, with the goal of preserving the body in the most lifelike appearance possible. But in fact, recent studies have shown that perhaps binding rather than preservation was as much the goal. And I found in an earlier study that evisceration, in fact, was extremely rare and highly correlated to the highest elite, but not even entirely consistent here. So how do I know that this little child's mummy was actually bound? For one thing, you can see the outline of a coffin around in sort of linear alignments there. But you may notice something weird about this mummy. If you look carefully, you see that this child is on his or her face. You can't really tell with someone so young what sex they are. And so this is rather undignified. Why would a mummy appear on her face? But in fact, right at the place where you would expect them to appear. Here, a necklace around their neck. We found this group of amulets, exactly as you would find it if the parents had placed it around their neck. Little amulets of the god Bes, the goddess Taweret. They're in very abstract form, fishes and so on, all to protect their child as they made their journey into the afterlife. Very modest grave goods. But in fact, we think that the individual was mummified very heavily because that this face-down position clearly was not deliberate. Instead, what happened was, as they were wrapping the mummy, which could take a couple of weeks if you perform all the right rituals and everything, they clearly lost track of which side was up. And so at some point they looked and they had this mummy here, and the woman embalmer said, "Hey, Jehudi, I don't know which side is up." And Jehudi said, "Oh, many, I don't know. Why don't we just slap a face on one end and slap feet on the other end and call it done? Nobody's going to unwrap him, so it'll be fine." And in fact, they found a mummy with pretty well-preserved wrappings, although very fragile, from Thebes. And you can see clearly feet down at the end and a little bit decayed, but there was actually a nice bump where the nose should be. But in fact, when they unwrapped him, he was face down. So clearly the embalmers lost track. They just made it look like the person was face up. And Boki and our little kid had to spend 3,000 years face down, rather undignified. And similarly with amulets, so heart scarabs are quite rare, but what you do find are amulets like this one to the goddess Hathor, Hathor being the goddess of fertility, but also of rebirth, so that makes sense. Scarabs being the most common amulet that one finds, and again, tapping into that idea of the scarab and rebirth. The scarab beetle itself as a hieroglyph stands for Khepri, which means to come into being, and of course you have the god Khepri, who represents the rebirth of the sun on the horizon. And so all of these things add sort of magical potency, but in a very modest way, to individual burials. Now, people often ask me what's the coolest thing I've ever found, and I can't resist putting in an image of this one to make a point about also we have objects of daily life, and especially cosmetic equipment. So people wanted the equipment to look good in the afterlife, I guess. This is a little perfume bottle, beautifully made. It's an absolutely extraordinary object. It was from a wealthy tomb, but by no means the wealthiest. This little frog lid is astonishingly detailed, and a parallel for it was found on the island of Sicily. So it's a kind of motif that got around. Similar with Bes became popular in the Mediterranean world, especially when this bottle was made around 700 BCE. But it shows how cosmopolitan Nubians were at that time. They weren't kind of a backwater in the shadow of Egypt, but they controlled Egypt. They were players in the Mediterranean world, and they were consumers of this kind of amazing artwork, and perhaps producers as well. There's a long tradition of faience production in Nubia, and perhaps they made this one. So that's more the reality of mummies. So how did we end up with these modern mummy myths? Here you can see from the Mummy. And part of it is just the text kind of lend to the idea that spells were there to revive mummies. Here I've transcribed the spell for making a mummy into vocalized spoken ancient Egyptian. And it says, "Oho, rise up, Yahé Tisu, receive your head, Sish Punak Tapek, collect your bones, Yin Kuinak, Kasawek, gather your limbs, Ya Kuinak, Utak, and shake the earth from your flesh, Wichwinak, Ta'a Yaraya Wefek." So again, this sounds like a physical recreation of a mummy, maybe even a decayed body, not even mummified remains, into something like you see in this imagery in the Mummy film. But in fact, it was really to revive the deceased, to allow them to live again in the afterlife. And before I move on, I just have to say, do not try this in a museum because, no good can come of that with mummies around. Just don't do it. You'll want to, but just don't do it. So one major source was also spiritualism. So Arthur Conan Doyle was very much engaged with this, so we can see in his stories, especially The Ring of Thoth, a real exploration of hermeneutic philosophy, or hermetic rather, philosophy, which includes the concept of reincarnation. It is an actual Egyptian text, although written in Greek by an Egyptian priest, but clearly influenced by Hellenistic thought as part of really a dynamic mix of Egyptian, Middle Eastern, and Hellenistic ideas and philosophies that was churning around in Egypt in the first centuries CE. But this does have an idea about reincarnation, so it's not entirely unreasonable. However, we do know from ancient Egypt, as I said, the only story that ever actually worked that ever actually mentions reviving a revived mummy was the story of Setnakh-Amas and the mummies. Similar with curses. So Tutankhamun was supposed to have had a curse. Marie Corelli, a kind of potboiler romance novelist, said that the tomb had a curse on it. They who enter the sacred tomb shall swiftly be visited by wings of death. In fact, this didn't happen at all. There was an inscription on a chest of Anubis. It said, "I who hinder the sand from choking the chamber, I am for the protection of the deceased." And then some journalist tacked on a completely fictional addendum to this saying, "And I will kill all those who cross this threshold into the sacred precincts of the royal king who lives forevermore." But no, that's just complete fiction. And in fact, the chest itself contained magical protection in the form of amulets for the mummy. Another heavy influence on these films was that idea of Orientalism. So I'm often asked, do I feel guilty about advising for these films because they create these misconceptions? But I disagree with that premise. I think, in fact, they're not creating those conceptions about Egypt that Edward Said outlines more generally for the Middle East of North Africa, of Orientalism, sensuous, dangerous, the exotic East compared to the rational West. But in fact, these are deeply seated prejudices and perceptions and misconceptions that exist within Western popular culture. And that goes back to misinterpretations of ancient Egyptian texts, of that idea of a curse that's based on the notion that all of the team members, or many of them, who excavated Tutankhamun's tomb died. And newsflash, yeah, they're dead, but many of them died decades after the tomb. I mean, it was excavated in the 1920s, so yeah, they're all dead. But some of them lived until their 80s. Lady Evelyn Herbert, who was Carnarvon's daughter, who was present at all stages of the tomb, lived well into her 80s. And so there's no reason to think that there even was a curse. The only person who died was Carnarvon in connection with the tomb, and that was from blood poisoning, actually from pneumonia after he had recovered from blood poisoning. So no connection at all. But these movies do play up this idea of the sensuous, dangerous, exotic East. There's a little bit of sexism thrown into it as well. So here you have the sort of fight scene between the two lovely heroines in skimpy outfits. So clearly, and if you listen to the commentary, the director is more than a little sexist, and the producer that are commenting about this, they're definitely playing these aspects of it up. Interesting enough, if you look in the background, all the costumes and whatnot are actually not bad. They're pretty reasonable renderings of what the court might have looked like. And in fact, the idea of having a bout like this in front of the assembled court is something that we do see in ancient Egypt, but not with women, but rather with men. And here you can see one that appears beneath the window of appearances at the mortuary temple of Ramses III at Medinet Habu in Luxor. And you can imagine the king sitting enthroned above, watching these people, maybe Egyptians fighting foreigners especially. And, like in pro wrestling, the fix was in. And the Egyptian, of course, would win, the foreigner be defeated. To demonstrate that order was the rule of the day. But in this case, you have the two lovely heroines fighting. And this is one point I was able to get a little Easter egg into the film from my Egyptological colleagues. So in this fight, they get going, and the lovely heroine on the right-hand side is usually a pushover, but she's actually giving the evil character on the left, who later on assassinates Seti I, a real run for her money. So she gets more and more pissed off over the course of this fight, finally defeats the lovely heroine and gives her a help up, and she's supposed to be saying, something like, oh, my princess, how you've improved. So instead, I had her say, Nikati ah. And so if you're interested, you could repeat this, Nikati ah. And you just said, may you do something rude with a donkey. Which is actually a real ancient Egyptian curse, recorded on a papyrus, satirical papyrus, needless to say, about a scribe who's writing to another scribe with the theme of, you're an ignoramus, you're a fool, and this line turns up. So a little Easter egg for you. Turned out, you have to listen very closely, but you can hear it in the film. And so I think that what these films do is, reinforce these long-standing ideas, but then what we can do as scholars is give them a little bit more accuracy. And in fact, I know a number of Egyptologists who were inspired to pursue Egyptology by watching the films Stargate and the Mummy movies, and certainly more generally with archaeology, the Indiana Jones films, which are also wildly inaccurate. But if we can spark people's interest in pursuing more, and we can do something interesting like the vocalization, which itself was valuable. I remember having an epiphany on the set of Stargate as the actor was speaking ancient Egyptian with those reconstructed pronunciations, but in the context of a scene, acting in a normal speaking pace with accent. And I could really hear the music of ancient Egyptian, the beauty of the language for the first time. And I hope that people have replicated that experience by watching these 3 films. Well, it's been a pleasure talking about this, sadly not with you because of the pandemic, but I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and I will leave you with that and say, it's a wrap. Hope you have a great rest of your day.